Maeve Binchy is a well-loved author whose sales probably outstrip those of all other Irish writers combined. Writing always out of a familiar Ireland, she has become a world figure, finding a universal resonance in the small local stories that are so familiar they have become invisible to us. For all that there is a feel-good factor about the novels, Maeve Binchy has a sharp eye for the telling detail that often strips a character bare. Refreshingly, she is infinitely more interested in other people than she is in herself, and her work is best thought of as storytelling in the grand tradition. Maeve, the obvious question, where did it all start for you?
Well, in a way it started when I went to England. That's when all the fictions writing started. I was 33 and I'd gone to a big capital city to live in and work, and I thought I'd know everybody there in a matter of days, and that I'd be walking up and down Fleet Street and they'd be saying, "How are you, Maeve?" and I'd be going to press receptions with a whole crowd of English journalists. But in fact it takes a very long time to get to know people in England, and in England then, which is 25 years ago, was obsessed, they were all obsessed talking about traffic. Like we have become here ourselves now. It took us a quarter of a century to catch up. But everybody constantly talking about the traffic. So I had nowhere to go after work very often, instead of having 20 places to go as you would in Dublin. So I sat in my office in the Irish Times in Fleet Street and I used to write short stories. So I gathered a whole lot of short stories together and went to a publisher, and he said they wouldn't buy a book of short stories because you're a nobody. If you were a somebody, they'd buy a book of short stories. So then he said, could you put a little spurious link between them? So I rewrote them again and I called them Central Line, and they're all having taken place in stations along the Central Line. And it sold 5,000 copies, which was grand. And then the second one, Victoria Line, sold 3,000 copies. So the graph was going down, and that wasn't the way it was meant to be. So I paused and took a bit of thought.
Did the Irish Times ever bill you for the heat and light in the office after hours?
Generous to a fault, that paper is.
And how did the journalism and the fiction work together for you?
Well, in fact, what I was doing in London at that time was an interesting thing. It was I was writing as a features writer, because relations between the two lands take upturns and downturns. There was a very bad downturn at that time. It was the time of the bombs in London, and it was a time when there's a lot of anti-Irish feeling. But also it was a time when maybe at home we didn't perhaps understand exactly how little and uninvolved, I was going to say, or uninvolved the ordinary English people were with what happened in Northern Ireland. They just wanted it to go away. And I wanted to try and write about England and tell stories about people, to try and show the way they lived and to try and give you like case histories. So the two worked quite well. I was constantly looking at people, watching them and trying to see what was making them tick. So that made writing short stories kind of easier, because I was, if you like, researching it for the columns as well.
But then you moved to the novels, and I mean, everybody has some idea in the back of their head of what a novel should be, and it's surprising how different that can be. Who had you been reading growing up?
Well, the people I read, I would be glad to know, very glad to know, that I never tried to write like them at all, because I read almost everything I laid my hands on, and my favourite authors, when it's interesting when you're asked who is your favourite author, my favourite authors have been, say, William Trevor, Alice Munro, the Canadian writer, and someone like Jennifer Johnson, and a lot of these would be the people I would like very much. I never tried to write like any of them. I never noticed what their style was, because all I wanted to do was to tell a bigger short story. That's what I tried to do in Light a Penny Candle. And I believed I had this kind of blinding insight into the obvious, which was that you wrote better about something you knew about. And in other words, you were walking with a steadier foot and a surer kind of step. So what did I know about? I asked myself there. I was 30, what was I? I was nearly 40. I was 40 indeed. And what do I know about? I know about Ireland and England being very different countries, that we were divided by the common language, really, because the Irish talked about everything in a stream of consciousness, and the English were inclined to say yes and no. And we were hurt by that, but that's just the way they have in their language the words yes and no, and we don't in the Irish language. Those words don't exist. And I thought I'd write about a friendship, because I knew a lot about friendship. I'm merciful. I've had most of my friends since I was very young, which has been lovely. And I know how important women's friendships are. And so I decided to write about the friendship between an imaginary Irish girl and an English girl, and how it lasted through everything else. And I wrote and wrote and wrote. And like the way I speak, I don't pause much for punctuation or anything like that. Just went on and on and on. I wrote this enormous book. And then we gave it into the publisher, and who rang up and most unexpectedly said, because most publishers would tell you that it's the wrong time of year, or, you know, it would be good if it was a book by a man or by a small person or by a young person or whatever to be. But she rang up and she said, it's amazing. It's going to be, and hugely, she kept using this word, it's so accessible. And I had no idea whether that was good or bad. I kept thinking access to wheelchairs, an access card is a thing that you can get things. And I said nervously on the phone, is that good or bad? And she said, well, it's great. And so then suddenly it became very popular. I thought, sure, nobody is going to be interested in that except the Irish and possibly the English. And then it just took off from there.
And had you no idea who you were writing to?
No, I was telling a story as
No
if I
idea
was
at all?
chatting. Never had, and really never have, because you start painting by numbers. If you write kind of popular fiction and you start imagining, well, my target audience is 30 to 38 married working mothers in this income, well then, you know, you really are trying to write a formula book that'll please them. And in the end, if you're just telling a kind of a rambling story, hoping to make the people sound real, like I often would, I'd find myself telling a story anywhere, at a holiday resort or at someone's house or over a bridge table, when I should be trying to think, you know, whether all the trumps were out. I'd be telling some long rambling story. And that's exactly the way I write. If I'm interested in the people, I could talk about them forever and ever. And that's the only way I approach it. And I wouldn't stop to think, I wonder, will the American market like this, or would it get more men readers if I did that? Because I think that way you really end up trying to please everybody and maybe pleasing nobody.
And does the pace of the story dictate everything? I mean, you don't stop to think, well, maybe I should try writing shorter sentences, or do you just tell the story as it comes in your head?
Yes, I tell the story as it comes to my head, exactly. You see, I suppose I should speak in shorter sentences sometimes. I should pause maybe and let you get a word in edgeways. And I sometimes tried to remember. I tell you, I got a terrific piece of advice once from Hugh Leonard when he was the literary editor and advisor in the Abbey Theatre when I'd written the first play. And he said, which was so truthful, I never forgot it. He said, you have people making speeches. And one person makes a speech and then they stand back and then the next person makes a speech. He said, listen, just listen to the way people talk. They interrupt each other all the time. They say short things. And so therefore, I allow my characters to interrupt each other. I have slightly shorter sentences in dialogue, and which is good, because it is very good to listen to people. I'm always listening to people and getting information from listening to the way they talk. Because you see, especially it's good to listen when you don't think they're listening to you. Even today now, I was standing in a shop and I was watching a mother and daughter have a conversation over what magazine the girl was going to spend her money on. And it was great because they didn't know anyone was listening to them. Then you saw the real way they talked. So I think that's a good thing to do.
Do you think coming out of an oral culture has shaped the kind of books you write?
I think for a start in Ireland we're terribly lucky because nobody ever said to us that we should wait until we had something to say before we spoke, because that's always a terrible holder backer of everybody. That I think has really sort of upset and stultified some nations who think that they have to do that. I also think that you shouldn't, you know, for example, the concept of the listener isn't very strong in Ireland. You know, people often said that you have these old etiquette books, you should have 4 talkers and 4 listeners at your dinner table. I mean, and where would you find the listeners? I mean, who would be willing to play that role? And I think it's a good thing to begin a sentence and have no idea of how it's coming to an end. I would hate to be someone who spoke in measured sentences, knowing that this is the way the sentence was going to finally end. I'd hate that.
And given that, you know, it's a very Irish thing, and protects, you know, that kind of Irish garrulousness.
Yes, it is
a good thing from our point of view. Are you not bewildered in some sense to have millions of readers all over the world, often from very different cultures?
Well, it's startling sometimes when I see the foreign editions arriving, and only my own round face staring at me from the back cover makes me realise that it really must be me. And of course also the various amounts of zlotys and yen and things that would come in, and realise that obviously this isn't just some way of fooling myself, so I'm making all these books. But it is surprising. I get letters from people, and I usually send them to the embassies concerned if I can't translate them, and ask them if they'd be kind enough to give me a feeling of what it would be, people say. And it's astounding that in far countries people say, you describe my childhood exactly, or this is exactly what happened to me in my childhood. So I suppose what I must be writing about is something that's kind of fairly common to everybody, indeed, you know, fairly routine, that everybody, all young women have had a terrific anxiety about the future. Everybody's gone through a bit of betrayal and a bit of hope that things are going to work out all right, and you know, educational problems, fear that marriage won't last, confusion on behalf of their children. These are kind of everyday problems in every part of the world that they must have. So I've stopped wondering really why they all get so interested in it. I just say, isn't that great?
Are you ever tempted just for sheer badness to break the pattern? It's a terribly grim, dark novel about last things.
No, I'm not. But I try to mix in the books stories of in a lot of my books. It makes me annoyed sometimes when people call them cosy. I mean, you can't be annoyed with anybody as entitled to say what they want about any book. But you see, I don't think I'm a cosy writer. In all of my books, there's death, and there's betrayal, and there has been abortion, and there has been people going off to war, and there have been lies, and there have been illness. And I don't think this is cosy necessarily. These are things that happen in life, and I'm never tempted to write anything just out of pure diverment to annoy the reader. But I think I bring quite a fair spectrum of human life, and with its good and its bad. And I do have a sort of a bossy, teacherish attitude, which is that nobody is truly, truly bad. And in all my villains, I give them a bit of a saving decency. I mean, like they like dogs or something. And I give them also, as well as that, in all the heroes and the heroines, I give them all the occasional annoying, irritating characteristic and trait, because we all have that. I think a person who is perfect, I think a novel, a popular novel, divided into those who are the good guys who wear white and gold and are handsome, and those are the bad guys who are twisted and gnarled and ugly. I think that's kind of nonsense. That's only the stuff for children's pantomimes. I don't think it's the stuff for a real story.
You've been writing adult books all your life in that sense. I mean, the early books are set in the 50s and 60s. The last two have been set in more up-to-date Ireland. But I mean, you've dealt with abortion, loneliness, disastrous marriages, death, and so on. Do you ever feel you're telling the chronicle of your times? Do you ever have that sense of self-consciousness about it?
I suppose I am telling the chronicle of my times in one case, and it's interesting. There was a student in Holland who was doing a dissertation about the change in Irish life since 1940 to 60, as seen through my books, which I was thrilled, because when I wrote books set in the 40s in the beginning, even though I don't really remember all the 40s that hugely well, since I was born in 1940. But wasn't looking on with huge, sharp eyes for the first 10 years. But the way it's all changed is so incredible. We all think we've lived through different times and changed times, but I really have lived through almost 6 decades of the most extraordinary change in Ireland. And when I look out the window of my house, and I live in Dalkey still, as I did when I was young, when I remember the roads, absolutely heavy with people in headscarves going to Mass, I remember that for years and years and years. When you see shops open and everything totally different on a Sunday, it seems as if you've gone to a different planet.
When £50,000 in the sweeps was an unimaginable fortune, and their house is selling for £1 million down the road.
I know, it is extraordinary. So, I mean, I have lived through an interesting and very, very changing time. I think in Ireland, which was such a sheltered country in the 50s, other countries were less sheltered. To have had your teenage years in the 50s and then to be living in your maturity, for want of a better word, in the 90s is a gigantic change. So that's why I started to drag myself kicking and screaming to the end of the 20th century in the last 2 books to try and write about the present day. It's also because I've come back to live in Ireland full time. When I was living in England, I was nervous to write about modern day Ireland, because I was afraid, because I only came back on holidays, that I mightn't have got it right. You know the way people go on a holiday somewhere and they think they've everything absorbed in 10 minutes because they've come in there. I really had to be living here for a few years before I felt confident about writing about modern day Ireland.
But weren't people always telling you stories all through that? I mean, people are always telling you stories. Do people come up still and tell you things?
They do, and they're very interesting. People are telling people things all the time around here. This is what's the best place.
But specifically hoping you'll write them?
Well, they do, and very often people do write to me and say, my story is very, very interesting, you should do that. And do you know what it's usually about? And it's terribly sad. It's usually about somebody whose mother had gone away and didn't come back to her, somebody who was brought up in care, or somebody who was adopted and wanted to know where her mother was. It's usually good. I must have had 30 or 40 of those letters, which have broken my heart, because then I would ask them to try and write it themselves, and they said they'd like me to write the story. And I've always said truthfully that I really prefer to try and have my ideas totally made up by myself. Being a lawyer's daughter, I'd be afraid to mention a real person in a book.
Get sued.
In case you get my poor father used to always say that, don't ever put a real person into the book, or we'll be paying the litigation for the rest of our lives. But it's not only that, it's just that if I was to tell somebody else's story without being fired by my own imagination about it, I don't think I'd tell it really. I wouldn't tell it with any warmth, because I'd be afraid I'd be hurting the person. I wouldn't be able to make the person who was the heroine of the story give her the nice little weaknesses that I always give every heroine. For example, in Tara Road, I have made my heroine lovable, but also terribly silly from time to time, where you want to give her a sharp slap and tell her to wake up. And, and all the heroines, I've given them something like that, that they're not perfect, because I just don't think there are perfect people. Even all the people I know and love, I think it would be absurd to assume that anyone is perfect.
Isn't it very odd that people who don't read your books do think of you as cosy? I'm thinking back to something you said earlier.
Well, you see, I suppose I look cosy, you see. I'm kind of large and optimistic and comfortable, and I think well of people, and I'm not immediately in there with the hard word about things, and I'm always thinking, actually, maybe he didn't mean it, or she's not the worst. And so that's the kind of a cosy personality. It's the way I feel, but I don't bring it to my writing.
Is it maybe a reservation that people have consigned popular fiction to as well? Is it popular fiction somehow can't be all so serious?
Well, I think that's true, because I think that not in this country now as much as in some other countries, certainly in European countries, I gather there's an absolute rigid divide, a chasm between what's popular fiction and you know, and what is intellectual fiction and what is serious fiction. There's not that much in Ireland, because everybody sort of swims across the divide from one to the other, or we think we do, or we read both kinds. And of course, people sometimes use the words airport fiction to describe some of my books and other people who sell a lot of books. And I don't regard that as a huge, terrible put down or an insult at all. You see what I mean about being good-natured and cheerful about things? But I don't regard that as an insult, because at an airport, people would want to go, maybe would have time, because they might be going on a holiday or on a journey, and they might want to have time to read something, or read a story. They mightn't have time at home in their daily life. I don't regard it as something just to be, as trash to be thrown away. And I'm never upset if people call it popular fiction, a popular fiction writer. That I don't see a sneer in that word. I set out to tell a story, and when you tell a story, after all, you're looking for an audience to tell it to. You don't tell a story to the wall.
Well, Homer, sitting around by the fireside, wasn't hoping that a couple of the cognoscenti would stay with him and that the rest would kindly go away. What kind of ambitions do you have for your books?
I want people to think I've read that story and I understood what those people are like, or I was in their house. Somebody very nice, you know, you remember a couple of nice good reviews people say about you. You also, of course, remember and then try to forget the bad things they say. But a nice thing somebody said was that you felt that you knew the people in the house, and you look up and you're surprised they're not in the living room with you. Now, I was delighted with that. That was one nice review, which I remember, and I'm quoting loudly now on the television. But I think that was a lovely thing to say, because that's what I would want. I would want people to think that the characters were real, and that they sort of knew them, and that they were friends, or that they had brushed across them. I mean, at Christmas I got a letter from a woman who said that she was just about to send a Christmas card to two of my characters, and then she wondered when the men about to come and take her away, and men in the white coats. And I was thrilled to hear that. I was thrilled, because I mean, she thought they were so real she was going to send them a Christmas card. I was delighted. So that's really the ambition I have, that to have created people, to describe them so well. And I'm not much on the describing the physical descriptions. In fact, I always forget to do the physical descriptions of people. And at the end of the book, when the book goes into the publisher, it comes back, you see, you know, for the editing, for the process of editing, which is the bits where they tell you that what's wrong and all the rest of it. And the words physical description, you know, in the margin almost on every character we meet, because I forget to describe what they look like.
You get the note that says, Maeve, you forgot to get him to take his clothes off before he went to bed.
Not so much that, but just I forget to say if somebody is tall or blonde or small or fat and black haired or whatever it is. I forget to say that, because I have a vision in my mind, and I'm not an artist. I'm not a visual artist at all, and I just want to tell the story. If I was listening to somebody telling a story, I wouldn't say, or maybe I should say, what did she look like? But I want to say, go on, what did he do then? What did they say? Did they get married? What did the mother-in-law say? That's what I'd be interested in. And so I keep the pace of it going along. And I think I'm poor on the old physical description bit, but I'm always told by the publishers, whom I agree with. I have two women who have been reading my book since the word go. One is an agent and one is an editor, and they're both very, very good. And they meet apparently, like, I don't know this, I'm not meant to know this, but apparently they meet like each other the night before they meet me, you see, on each book. And then they say apparently horrific things like, this is absolutely dreadful, we'll never rescue this one. And then they meet me, and then with terrifically polite smiles, they say, maybe we could shave a little bit off this, you know, like cut these 40 pages out, and maybe we could, you know, sort of slice another bit off that. And it's usually because I write too much. And when I meet a character, I think you'd want to know all about the character. So, for example, now in Tower Road, there's a dentist who comes in about 4 times. But before the girls got at him with the carving knife, you know, he was there all the time. And there was loads about him. I gave him and his wife a huge life and their difficult daughter and all the rest of it. And it was pointed out to me that you lost the track of the main characters. It was like a Cecil B. DeMille movie with a cast of thousands. If you have everybody equal, the tapestry was too big. But you were meant to keep an eye on the main characters and know who you were meant to be following, which I accept totally. But in the next book that I write, I'll probably put a cast of thousands in again and rely on people with sharper sense of where a story is going to take them out.
Maybe you should be writing 2 books or 3 books all at the same time.
No,
do you take kindly to being edited?
Yes, very much. Very much. For a bossy, opinionated person, which I am, I believe very much that everybody is good in their own sphere, and the editor and agent who have advised me well in the past. They don't write novels or short stories themselves. They don't even like creative writing, no want to do it. But they know when something's wrong or where something's got a bit boring and dreary. And so they've been right so far. Sometimes I fight to keep back. You know, they always say that making movies and writing books, they hate when they take out your little darlings. And if you have a lovely little darling of a piece and they don't want to, sometimes I fight for the odd bit to keep back. But usually I listen to what they say and I think they're right. And I don't believe my own publicity. I don't think, you know, gosh, I have this wonderful sharp eye for everything else and I get it all right. I don't believe that at all.
Yeah. Do you have to be at home to write? Because you travel an enormous amount now doing readings and going to film locations and whatever.
I don't have to be at home to write, no. I have just a small laptop computer and I can be anywhere. I just read I wouldn't read the whole of what I'd written yesterday, but I'd just see where we got them to. And I'd maybe read the last page. And then the best thing anybody ever told me was I didn't necessarily write better when I wrote slowly. Now, they didn't say you write better when you write quickly, but they said you didn't necessarily write any better when you wrote slowly. So I believe that, and I do write very quickly. And I don't read it too deeply what I'd written yesterday, because sometimes it could look to you like Chekhov at his best, and sometimes it could look to you like the ramblings of a mad person, and it would depress you. So I just read enough to know where I am and to continue.
Do you read other books while you're writing?
Oh, I do. But you see, but since I'm in the kind of books I'm reading at the moment now, I'm reading thrillers. I'm reading lots of thrillers, about 4 thrillers beside my bed. I read them just in case I'd finish one in the middle of the night, maybe I have them there, and I could never write a thriller. I could never ever write a thriller to save my life. But I love those, and I find them huge relaxation.
And who do you read? I mean, who do you read for pleasure?
Well, I read
for a holiday, say.
For a holiday now, I'm going away shortly to America for a long tour. Only an insane person would call it a holiday. I'm going off to do a book tour for 26 days in America. And so I'll have the odd bit of free time. I'll have time on planes from one place to another. And I'm taking Jennifer Johnson's new book with me, and I'm taking, what else am I taking with me? I'm taking, again, there's another Alice Munro that I haven't read, and I think she's absolutely splendid. I could read her all the time. And I'm taking some of the new Irish books that I haven't read also with me. I haven't read John Connolly's, and I haven't read Julie Parsons' new book. And I'm taking them away. I'd probably have to leave them after me in places because the suitcase is very heavy.
Like great presents.
Wouldn't they, indeed?
Do you have superstitions about writing?
No. I have a superstition sometimes if the cat sits on the typewriter and refuses to get off it. I think, well, that maybe the cat has understood something, that maybe the muse is gone for the day. It's time to go and have a cup of tea. But I don't really have any superstitions. No, I don't have to have, you know, like you often read about people who have to have certain, be pointing north or have pencils sharpened or anything like that.
Marquez has to have yellow roses in the room before
That's
he can
right.
write. Yeah.
I'd be afraid. Now, I'm not being shruggy about this, but I wouldn't take myself as seriously as that. I mean, you wouldn't have a superstition before you started to tell a story to somebody. You wouldn't have to say, excuse me, let's all sit down in this order and then I'll tell you the story. I mean, you'd have lost your audience by that stage. So I mean, because I regard it literally as an extension of just the babbling on, and hopefully in some direction. At least I don't want to think that I just sit down and run off at the mouth and it all appears there. I do have a plan, I do have a scaffolding, and I have a piece of cardboard in front of me when, as soon as I put a new character in, I put them in, put him or her in, and I give him or her a house and a birthday. And the reason I give them a birthday is that when I was writing Firefly Summer, I forgot to give the child a birthday in it, and I discovered much later, when the book was nearly finished, that the time he was expelled from school, he was 25 years of age. And that wasn't much help, because I had an awful lot of rewriting. And then when I was writing Echoes, I didn't give myself some timing in terms of like a schedule of, by the end of chapter 1, this must have happened. And then I'd written nearly 700 pages in Echoes, and nobody had reached the age of puberty. So I thought, like, none of the things that had been arranged in the outline could have happened. So therefore, I have to be more disciplined to myself than I was in those days. And then, for example, now in a book, I would just say, it's kind of like a warning self-help note. By the end of chapter 5, this must have happened. By the end of chapter 9, that must have happened.
Do you start with an outline, or is it just a character comes into your head and you want to follow her? Or
it started with an emotion, you know, usually an emotion in, I just started about the emotion in Tara Road, for example, as, you know, what would happen if you, as I'm sure must happen all around us, said she, unsettling people, that one member of a partnership, of a love affair, of a marriage is totally happy with it and thinks it's working fine, and the other member of that partnership is bored absolutely rigid for it. And like, I was wondering what would happen to that, and I've tried to examine it. I tried to imagine in the scene where he told her he was leaving. I tried to imagine that, and I remember writing that, because, you know, it hasn't happened to me in a marriage, but I could imagine, you know, what it would be like. And I tried to imagine what words I would say and what words he would say. And I was quite pleased that scene when I'd finished, because I just wrote it and wrote page after page after page. And then it was over, and she had fainted, and the guy had gone home, and I read it all over again, and I was quite pleased with it, because I've been just trying to think what I'd have done myself, and that's the way I wrote it. And I'm, you know, maybe somebody else reading it would say it was drivel, but I thought it was grand.
But take somebody in a situation like that and reading a scene like that. Do people pick up their pens and write in and say, you've got it all wrong, that's not how it feels, that's not how it happens?
Well,
Do you have this dialogue going on all the time with readers?
Well, readers, there is a dialogue, and an awful lot of them wrote to me about because it hasn't been published in America yet, but in lots of other English-speaking countries. And they wrote and said, first of all, that I was too kind to the erring husband. You know, that he should have.
He was still alive at the end
yes,
of the book.
he had too great a command, and also that I wasn't a good enough role model, which is interesting for young women, by allowing the battered wife to remain battered, and to think afterwards, when her husband was dead, that she did a wonderful marriage. But I was just thinking, suppose I knew somebody who was beaten and had a rotten time, and mercifully, holy God, had taken her husband away. I would not say, I don't think I would say, this is being kind again, I don't think I would say, come on, face up to it, was terrible, it was rotten, look back on your life, you had nothing, you spent years of your life with a madman, and that makes you a mad woman. I wouldn't say that to somebody. If somebody wanted to deify and canonise somebody afterwards, I would just, certainly in the early days, I would allow that. And in Australia particularly, where they're extremely politically correct, and in Canada, people were saying to me that I should have been much tougher on that bit. And that was, so quite a lot of women took me up on that. But again, it was nice dialogue, it was good. I mean, we talked, and I think defended myself fairly spiritedly.
But it raises an interesting question, doesn't it? I mean, what's fiction for?
I think it's for people to lose themselves and to imagine themselves in another life, and when it's successful, it's absolutely great. I mean, you know, something like Shipping News, you know, a book like that, you go off and you're in that awful place eating squid burgers with all those people up in Annie Proulx's story. People you never met before. You live their life when you get a good bit of fiction like that. And then you come out again and say, oh, I'm not up there anymore, I'm in Dalkey. And so fiction, I think, is for you to write a number of words that will make somebody else read them, and for a while suspend their belief in their own life and come into the life you've created. And for me to do that is the biggest joy in the world.
But the commenting voice in all of the novels, the presence of the author, or the fictive author, it's always very moral. It always has a moral view. So, I mean, doesn't it follow that in some sense the novels have a moral intent? I
suppose so. And again, it's because...
I don't mean didactic now.
No, I think there is a moral view. But right, if not triumphs, it doesn't always triumph. A lot of the people are losers in the end. They don't get what they want or what might have been right to them. But I've always believed in the old sort of... You know, they used to tell us when we were young that if you're good, you'll be happy, and that is not true. That is just not true. Now, it's not true that if you're bad, you'll be happy either, but it's not true that if you'll be good, you have to try and make your own life, in a sense. You have to, and I mean, for somebody who's such a bad bridge player, to use a card metaphor is idiotic, but you have to play the cards that you're dealt. And I think that's my only moral and my only lesson in them. Books are not makeover stories. They don't become more beautiful, more rich, or more intelligent very often, but the ones who become confident are the ones who win. And I think that's the message I'm saying. And I try not to be too bossy to the characters, but I also want to let people think that there is a kind of a salvation for all of us in the way we live our lives, if we can try and do it with our own two hands.
Do you feel a sense of fellow feeling with other authors, living and dead? I mean, just because what you're describing is a particular stream of the novel. And do you feel a sense of kinship?
I do. I just feel a sense of I know what it's like for them to be writing that. I've met, I mean, one of my great heroes of all time. I met him once, was William Trevor. I think everything that man writes is so beautiful. And I was horrified when I met him, because he told me that when he wrote a short story, he put it in a drawer in the bottom of his desk, and he went back to it a year later. Well, you know, I nearly had to sit down and have a drink of water when he told me that, because, you see, having been trained in a newspaper, you know, when you wrote something, you expected to see it in print the next day. And if you didn't, you'd be hysterical. If you had to wait a week, I couldn't even write for a weekly paper, or a monthly magazine would be much too long. And writing a book is hell, because it takes another sort of 6 months before you actually see it. And the idea that a man like that he said he could take it out of his drawer then, and it was like as if somebody had highlighted it in yellow for him. He would see the bits that were wrong after a year. So I wrote one short story, and I had to ask Gordon to lock the drawer, because every time anybody wanted a short story, I was about to take it out and give it to them. And I looked it after a year, and I had no notion of whether it was good or bad. And I just sent it off again. I couldn't see, there was no bit yellow highlighted it for me. So I am interested in the way other people work. I'm very interested, in the various people you've had on the programmes and the way they work and they describe their attitude to work. But I don't sort of, in any sense, feel a sense of fellow feeling with them. That we're all members of some great group together, because they're all so different and everybody is so different. I like fellow teachers when I was a teacher for 8 years. I did feel a kind of a bond. We're all trying to do something and we're all trying to tell stories, right?
Is there a book you've always dreamed of reading? Do you have an idea of the ultimate book that you'd love to come across?
That's a very good question. I don't. I suppose some of those marvellous novels out of South America and Mexico and everything, I was very interested in those. I'd like to have a book, perhaps, who could let me know, I'd like to read a book where I could understand what it would be like to have a Latin and Mediterranean temperament. I could understand from inside. I could really just look at people in these countries and see their marvellous, volatile excitability. I'm not quite sure what they're thinking about. I'd like to know from the heart, maybe from a woman's point of view, what it would be like to be say brought up in a Latin or American Mediterranean culture. I've never read a book like that.
If all your books come from your endless fascination with other people, if that went away, do you think you'd stop writing?
I suppose I would, but I think it'd be very unlikely that people would stop being interesting to me, because I've always believed that nobody's life is ordinary and dull if you know where to look.
Well, they can certainly look in your books. Maeve Binchy, thank you very much.
Thank you, dear.